Hello, I'm here with Professor Yvo Desmedt, who is the Johnson Distinguished Professor at the University of Texas at Dallas. Professor Desmedt, thank you very much for joining me today.
You're welcome.
So, for many years, you lingered in relative anonymity, shall we say, in the computer science department and at the University of Texas, and all of a sudden, thanks to the NSA, this has become a rather interesting area for a lot more people.
I would say for a lot more people because the hackers and also researchers in the community knew about it for a long time. There was a book that was actually published in the 90s, and the title of that book was The Puzzle Palace. And so people who had read that book, and also David Kahn wrote a book much earlier, called the Code Breakers. So people who read these books knew the technical capability of NSA, and also people who basically read the Patriot Act knew that basically NSA was given the power to do this massive eavesdropping.
In fact, I remember, I think it was the late 1990s when Larry Ellison of Oracle said that if you think you've got any privacy left thanks to the internet, think again, actually. So he seemed to have noticed the same thing, that basically privacy was gone at least 20 years ago with this wonderful thing that we call the World Wide Web.
Yeah, so I would say actually the problem started with the telephone. Once the telephone was invented,
that was it.
The governments wanted to be able to listen in. And we have seen that every time there is a new invention that can be abused, the government actually wants to have control. So when you buy a car, for example, today, the government knows where you are. If you have a mobile or a cell phone, then also the government knows where you are. So I don't carry one. I don't carry a mobile.
Never carry a mobile.
I did carry, but then I decided to stop it.
Oh, well, so if I try to get you on your cell phone, I'm not going to have any luck at all, actually.
No.
So, and do you find that are you able to opt out, so to speak, of the surveillance network by doing that? And
to a certain degree, because, for example, when Snowden traveled or was scheduled to travel from Moscow to Cuba, then a reporter from the BBC was supposed to sit beside him. Every time that you travel, it's easy to actually find out from where to where you're going to travel. It's even easy for a travel agency. So it's not, the reason I'm mentioning the BBC is that the BBC was able to basically call the travel agency and find out what flight is Snowden scheduled to take, and then book us a seat besides the Snowden. So privacy has been problematic. And so now the question is, will it be addressed or not, which is far from certain.
And what's your own opinion? Will it be addressed? Because I know there's been talk now, the president can proclaim himself to be shocked that all this was going on, actually.
So I gave a talk in 2012, October 2012 in the UK, in which I said, so this is pre-Snowden, as you realize, in which I said what we should actually do is have the target of the agencies, the spying agencies, change. Because what we have today is that there's a major difference between a communist regime and basically a democratic regime. In a democratic regime, the government is there for us. And we build all kinds of security mechanisms to make sure that the government is actually not going to overstep its authority. Mm-hmm. In a communist system, so if you think that basically you go back to Marx, then the government must be, by definition, the trusted entity. And so you can easily justify that actually in a communist system that the government is going to spy on its citizens. However, it is much harder to do that in a democracy. So what we also have seen in the meanwhile is that our values, democratic values, are no longer true. For example, Obama said he would not have lobbyists in his government, and yet anyway. And we see many, many instances where lobbyists play a role which one sometimes may regret. So the Japanese government has a report out after the Fukushima accident in which they actually clearly state what the consequences were of having lobbyists basically influence decisions on nuclear safety. So the question is, it used to be that basically some extremists were considered dangerous and therefore the government had to spy on them. But if we see the government is no longer there for the people, but that we're following more a communist system in which we are there for the government, what I've suggested last year is that the target of the spying agencies should change. That means that the target should become the government and also the lobbying organizations.
Is there any sign of that happening yet?
You never know. So there was a criticism of that, and so it was presented at a conference organized by philosophers. The philosophers didn't like it, but there was a technical guy there, and he said, "Why don't you send this to a more technical conference?" And so I presented it last month at a conference in Cambridge, where it was well received, but it was basically technical people there. And so one of the questions last year was, how will this be achieved? And so there are all kinds of possibilities how it can be achieved. So some people last year said, maybe the people need to start bugging the government so that we eavesdrop on the FBI, eavesdrop on the CIA, etc. I'm not basically suggesting that, but that was one of the suggestions. Another one is that there are always, once in a while, you have an idealist who becomes president. And so there are different scenarios where this may actually happen and that the target may actually change.
An idealist becoming president in the United States right now might be a very, very dangerous thing, actually, given the power of these agencies. I'm not sure that he would be able to do much, and in fact, he might be putting himself in grave danger by trying to challenge this security apparatus.
But so, for example, it's known that Kennedy challenged the advice, because a lot of during the Cuban crisis, it was said that the advice that was given by the military to the president is actually have a nuclear war. And it was said there, and it's clearly from the tapes, that only 50 million people would die in such a war. And said if you wait to have a nuclear war, then more people will die. And so the recommendation was, let's have this nuclear war now. And Kennedy basically ignored that advice. So there have been presidents who basically have ignored the advice that have come from the military or from the intelligence agencies.
And do you think things have fundamentally changed since 9/11? Has that been,
I think that, so that was one of the things that I gave in my the talk in 2012 and repeated in last month in Cambridge. I think that we are on a very, very slippery slope. We started by, so I think that after September 11, there needed to be emergency measures taken. Mm-hmm. But there has been basically the war in Afghanistan. And so the power of Al-Qaeda has been reduced. And so we need to look back and say, these measures were introduced temporarily. Shouldn't we go back to what we had before and making sure that we basically are the democracy that we claim to be, that we have the freedoms that we claim to actually have?
But that doesn't seem to be happening. If anything, we don't ever seem to reverse these measures once we adopt them. And in fact, the most disturbing thing about what's happened, say, in the United States is that many of the so-called dictatorial measures that were taken by George W. Bush have been matched and replicated and indeed extended by the current president. So the security apparatus has become bipartisanized in a very bad way, and therefore you have the situation where the next time you have a Republican president or a Republican Congress, they can simply say, well, you know, I mean, but your guy did this and we did that. And I don't see how you reverse that trend.
So one thing that may happen, which I also mentioned in my talks, is, for example, the Supreme Court. So already in Europe now, certain measures that were introduced after the London and Madrid bombing have been regarded as being too excessive, and basically the court there said no, they can no longer be used. So that's one hope. Another hope is a Cold War, because if there is a new Cold War, then what happens is the West can no longer pretend to have freedoms, because people will be looking critically at what we actually do in the West. And so although a Cold War may be very bad for all kinds of reasons, it may actually be good to restore freedom.
So maybe we should be urging on Mr. Putin to go to the eastern part of the Ukraine, is what you're suggesting.
I didn't say that.
No, I'm not. but it does seem to be interesting, because at least that when you had the Cold War, you had these two blocks, and it seemed that there was still this patriotic impulse, and that there was this need to distinguish ourselves, as you say, from the other regime, you know, which was much more intrusive, and the all-encompassing security apparatus. But we seem to be doing just as good a job on that right now, if not more, even more efficiently.
Yes, but the problem is that it's actually, if you look at the Constitution, it doesn't seem that actually it fits with what the US Constitution is. And I mean, if you look at other countries, as for example Britain, there's a Magna Carta, so there is this attitude that has been there in the West that has recently been basically demolished toward freedom, which is troubling, and this should be restored.
Is there anything that within the technologies that are being developed nowadays which can be used to subvert this trend, or is it just simply going to be expand this brave new world that you've described?
So there is technology. I myself do most of my research in cryptography, but I'm also quite aware of the limitations of cryptography because it can often be bypassed. So the main problem today that we face is computer security. And so to explain that, let me look at the operating system that's being used on most computers, which is Microsoft today, Windows. And so what happens is that operating system is more than 1 billion lines of code. And when the first version was actually written, Windows didn't care, Microsoft didn't care about the cost issues because, security was basically not a priority. And the reason was they wanted to make it as inexpensive as possible. And so, therefore, we actually have an operating system which security is not very good. And so they have then been patched, but we still have an operating system that is basically 1 billion lines of code. If you compare that to what goes in an airplane, which basically safety critical software is much more expensive to write. And the reason is it's much more carefully checked. And so as a consequence of that, we see bugs everywhere. And so almost on a weekly basis, something comes in the news about lack of the computer security. So there are measures that can be taken, but they are unfortunately also limited in the sense that, for example, if you think about flying, it will need a major change so that only you yourself can actually find your own seat, or basically the travel agency that usually books flights for you, and that not the BBC reporter can go and find on what airplane what flight that Snowden will be.
Of course, if you've got your mobile phone with it, that still creates problems for that. Yeah.
And the mobile phone also creates the problems. There are certain solutions that can be used. Unfortunately, it's always the criminals that use them. They basically, by phones, they only use once.
And then move on to the next one.
And then move on to the next one, yes.
To shift gears a little bit, you've also written some work on cyber voting and voting on the internet. That's been considered to be a panacea towards our lack of participatory democracy. But I would think that the scope for abuse, as the last few elections in the US have shown, are absolutely enormous if we go more towards internet style or cyber voting.
So what I'm really, really worried about, and so I was talking about it in 2010, is that a country as, for example, Russia, which is in the news now, is going to decide to basically influence the elections. And if we're going to decide, so there are many different approaches to electronic voting. One is that you have a computer where you go to a booth, and whether in a school or somewhere else, a public school, and there you go vote, or in the mayor's office. And the other one is where you vote from home. So the last where you vote from home is called internet voting. And the problem is that most people basically have no knowledge on how to set up a secure computer at home. There's a solution that was actually for a long time on the webpage of the one or another vice prime minister in Britain, which is very, very easy to hack. So there are all kinds of solutions that have been proposed. Unfortunately, the security of those has not always been taken into account. And so you have to start from the point of view that most people cannot make their computer secure. So the problem that what I'm concerned about is that now somebody else will actually take over the election. And in 2010, we actually showed that the former student wrote malware to show that a candidate could actually change the election. And what happens is that when you go on the web, you think everything is fine. So when you actually see two names of two candidates, you click on one. Yeah. And so what my student did, based on my advice, is basically make it in such a way that when you click on one candidate, without knowing it, it will always vote for the same candidate. Okay? And so you don't realize this at all, so you're completely fooled. They also had an audit system, so you could click on audit, and when you click on audit, it still gives you the impression that everything is fine, but in reality, things have changed.
So it opens scope for a huge amount of electoral abuse if you do something. And yet, as I suggested, the trend seems to be towards more internet-style voting. Does this problem continue even if you don't, say, do the voting in your own home, but you do it, say, at a secure voting booth and you use computers there?
So if you go to a secure voting booth, I'm not saying that the problems are gone. So the Professor Avi Rubin, who's now at Johns Hopkins University, together with other people, he has shown that some system which was actually used after the presidential election problems between Gore and Bush in Florida, that system can be hacked. But the hacking there is much more difficult in the sense that you have to physically go to that booth and then change the software or do modifications to that. So the company hadn't expected that problem. But the problem becomes much more aggravated at the moment that you're going to do internet voting from home. So using a computer to vote in a booth, I'm not saying is perfect. In 2010, there were some researchers who showed weaknesses in a system which is used in India. And the solution, the reaction of the Indian government was the people who found this problem, they were put in jail. Okay? So that's sometimes a very interesting reaction, which also used to be in the United States, is that the FBI would actually go after hackers. Nowadays, it's NSA actually hire hackers. So there's a different attitude.
One final question. Given this encroachment on our privacy and individual freedoms, is there anything that we as non-technologically savvy citizens can do to diminish the impact of the surveillance state?
So I think one problem is, what do you put on Facebook? I don't know whether you use Facebook.
I try not to.
Okay. But a lot of people put all kinds of information which is very private actually on Facebook. And they don't actually understand what the consequences of that are. So I think in general, what everybody should do is think, what do I do against myself by actually using this technology?
What about something like simple like email? Forget about Facebook. What if I'm starting to just send emails, because nobody sends letters anymore? They all use email. I mean,
so it's clear that, I mean, that you should consider that basically NSA can listen to your email.
Yeah.
The question is it that big a problem? So if you are inside a company, then basically the IT people can listen to your email. That's something that you have to start from. There are certain techniques that actually can be used. So a very old technique is PGP, but very, very few people actually use that. It's interesting to see that many people actually say, I prefer using Hotmail or Gmail, which may imply that now the IT people in your company may no longer be able to listen, but Google knows everything that you now do. So the problem, if you basically use Gmail or Hotmail, you shift from the people inside the company to actually now people in Google.
And effectively, much of that is subcontracted, as you say, to the private sector, Google and Yahoo and the like, and they have that database and they can use it to...
Not all organizations have subcontracted their email.
Yeah. But the Google people contended that they were absolutely shocked that the NSA was using their data in this manner, and I would have thought there was a degree of disingenuousness in their response. So they must have been complicit in some respect.
So it's very interesting to see what has. So people say the big Snowden leak, but when you look at the statistics, I think it's only 2% of all the data that actually he has on his disks that has been revealed to the press. Also, for example, there were certain slides that were used at a meeting with NSA, and of these slides, only 10 have been revealed. And in those, there is the word PRISM, which is basically a collaboration between companies as Google, Microsoft, and the government. We still today do not know what PRISM is.
Well, I hope that I have not compromised your own privacy too much by having you on to interview and letting us know a few of your secrets. But it's been most illuminating, if somewhat depressing, to hear what you have to say. So, Professor Desmedt, thank you very much for coming and talking to me today. Thank you.
Welcome.